everyone, and welcome to the September 2025 episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a fun way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. I'm Alice Chang from the University of Toronto.
And I'm Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast series. Welcome to September, everyone. Alice, what fun facts do you have about September for us this month?
Well, Mike, since you asked, I've got a bunch of fun facts for you. So, September has some important religious holidays, including Mawlid al-Nabi, celebrating the birth of the Prophet Muhammad in the Islamic calendar, as well as Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And for everyone who celebrates that, wishing everyone Shana Tova. Now, beyond these sacred celebrations, though, September also has some silly ones that I have to mention, like National Play-Doh Day and National Potato Day. But the best one by far is International Talk Like a Pirate Day on September 19th. Ahoy, matey. Oi be. Now it be your turn to talk like a gentleman of fortune.
So I've been thinking about so many ways of responding to that, Alice. And so, Play-Doh, potato, and to just say that there's no way you're going to get me to speak like a pirate. But
Oh, come on.
of course, since you did send me this link, which I just have to share with our listeners, lingojam.com/pirate speak. You did make it easy for me to say this to you, Alice. What does this ear have to do with diabetes? That's a terrible pirate.
I'm not sure that was pirate speak, but that was good. That was
I'm
really
not
good.
sure either.
I do appreciate that. We'll have to check with the pirates we know whether or not that qualifies, but I appreciate the effort. I don't think it has anything to do with diabetes, Mike, but it's fun and we need to have some fun sometimes. So, one last important fact about September, it's my birthday month. So, for anybody listening, if you happen to see me this month, gifts are always welcome.
Well, I think that gift needs to be a pirate costume for Halloween, Alice.
Awesome.
So with that, let's launch into the September episode of Diabetes Care on Air, in which we'll be interviewing authors of feature articles from the September issue of Diabetes Care and run through our popular rapid exchange segment where we will each pick 3 articles of particular interest to us.
Heave ho. One of the feature articles from the September 2025 issue of Diabetes Care is a brief report entitled Cardiovascular Outcomes and Efficacy of the PCSK9 Inhibitor Evolocumab in Persons with Type 1 Diabetes Mellitus, Insights from FOURIER Trial, by Dr. Yu Mi Kang and colleagues, with senior corresponding authors Dr. Mark Sabatine and Dr. Lawrence Leader. I'm joined today by the first author, Dr. Yu Mi Kang, endocrinologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome, Yumi, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this podcast, and congratulations to you and your colleagues.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here and excited to share more about our work.
Well, thank you, Yumi. So, in the August 2025 episode of this podcast series, I had the pleasure of interviewing the authors of a Perspectives in Care discussing the forgotten legacy of kidney disease in type 1 diabetes. And this month's interview is about cardiovascular disease in type 1 diabetes. So, Yumi, before we get into the details of the FOURIER trial and the analysis you performed, why is the topic of lipid management and cardiovascular risk reduction in type 1 diabetes important to address?
Thank you for the question. People with type 1 diabetes face a much higher risk of cardiovascular disease, and as they age, it becomes the leading cause of death. We're also seeing more people over 65 living with type 1 diabetes. Despite that, there have been no dedicated cardiovascular outcomes trials for the lipid management in this population. That means our lipid management decisions often rely on the evidence from type 2 diabetes or broader ASCVD populations. These are the approaches that don't always reflect the unique disease course and lifetime risk profile in type 1 diabetes.
So, okay, you've convinced us that this is an important topic with clearly a lot of evidence gaps and a lot of assumptions that I guess that we're making. So now let's get into what you and your group did. But to start off, though, can you briefly remind us about the FOURIER trial with the PCSK9 inhibitor Evolocumab? The initial publication was way back in 2017, right? I think I got the date right. So, Yumi, can you just remind us about FOURIER?
That's exactly right. FOURIER was a randomized, double blind, placebo controlled cardiovascular outcomes trial with over 27,000 adults who had established ASCVD and were already on moderate to high intensity statins. Participants were assigned to Evolocumab, which is a PCSK9 inhibitor, or to placebo, and they were followed for a median of 2.2 years. Now, the primary endpoint was a composite of cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, stroke, hospitalization for unstable angina, or coronary revascularization. The trial showed that adding evolocumab to statins lowered the LDL cholesterol by about 60% and significantly reduced the risk of major cardiovascular events.
Okay, so then what was the question that you asked in this post hoc analysis?
We wanted to know if we focus just on the participants with type 1 diabetes in FOURIER, did they get the same benefit from the intensive LDL cholesterol lowering with evolocumab as other groups? And if they do, is that benefit smaller, about the same, or even greater than what we see in people with type 2 diabetes or those without diabetes?
Okay, so now you've kept us in suspense long enough. So, what did you find?
First, we looked at the event rates for the primary endpoint in the placebo arm. They were 11% in people without diabetes, 15.2% in type 2 diabetes, and 20.4% in type 1 diabetes. That tells us people with type 1 diabetes are at higher risk for recurrent events compared to those without diabetes, and possibly compared to those with type 2 diabetes as well. Second, evolocumab lowered LDL cholesterol by about 55 to 60% across all groups, but both the absolute and relative risk reductions were numerically greater in people with type 1 diabetes. Specifically, the absolute risk reductions were 1.3% for no diabetes, 2.5% for type 2, and 7.3% for type 1 diabetes. The corresponding relative risk reductions were also 13, 16, and 34% respectively. Of course, the confidence interval for type 1 diabetes was wide because the group with type 1 diabetes was small.
So, from everything you just said, I mean, it sounds like those living with type 1 diabetes are at significantly higher risk, but there were a few things that sort of struck me as I was reading your paper. So, first of all, there were only 197 people living with type 1 diabetes in the study, which is about 0.7% of the population in FOURIER. So, a very, very small percentage of the entire FOURIER group. Now, although this reflects the approximate prevalence of type 1 diabetes in the general population, it is way less than the number of participants living with type 2 diabetes in FOURIER, which made up 39% of the FOURIER population. That is way higher than the general population. So I would have perhaps naively expected more people with type 1 diabetes to be included, given that they were not excluded. So, any speculation as to why there were not more people living with type 1 in this study?
That's a great question. And I really don't think there's a single explanation to this. However, I may speculate a few possibilities. One is that FOURIER excluded people with ESRD, which may have allowed more inclusion of participants with type 2 diabetes or even those with shorter disease duration overall. Another is that being a cardiovascular outcomes trial, FOURIER recruited largely from cardiology and vascular practices. Cardiologists often lead, and they should, the secondary prevention in people with diabetes and ACVD. But for the people with type 1 diabetes, we know that endocrinology and diabetology practices tend to follow these patients more often, which may have kept some of these patients from being referred to the trial. And finally, in our analysis, we used a fairly strict criteria to identify type 1 diabetes, at least for a trial based analysis. So those factors together could have amplified this difference in representation, but this is all speculation. So it really highlights why we need trials designed specifically for people with type 1 diabetes.
Hmm. And the subgroup with type 1 diabetes had higher LDLs and HSCRPs at baseline. So, do you think that this accounts for the higher event rates? And could it reflect the larger type 1 diabetes population, or were these people special in FOURIER? And are any other limitations that you want to note?
Thanks. For your first question, probably not. The reason why I'm saying this is because the LDL cholesterol levels and the hsCRP difference between the diabetes types, although there were some very small differences, they were minimal to reflect any clinically meaningful difference to my thought. In our multivariable model, adjusting for the LDL cholesterol, hsCRP, and other covariates really didn't change the observations that we had. So those factors don't seem to explain at least the full picture here. Instead, when the model included a combination of these three factors, which is longer diabetes duration or diabetes duration self, insulin use, and albuminuria, the observed differences started disappearing. So that sort of suggests the potential mediation. While this needs to be confirmed through future studies and larger studies, this finding is relatively consistent with what we know about the cardiovascular disease in type 1 diabetes. And as for limitations, the small number again of type 1 participants limiting the statistical power of the analysis would be the main one. And I believe this is the common challenge for any subgroup analysis involving this population. And in addition, we used a dedicated case report form and insulin use to classify the diabetes. So this is proven to have the positive predictive value of over about 80% in previous studies, and we're kind of reassured from the baseline characteristics that matched what we'd expect in clinical practice. However, there still could be some, proportion, a small proportion that might have been misclassified. And lastly, because this was a post hoc analysis, the findings, while compelling, should be viewed as hypothesis generating.
Good summary of the limitations. And can you just repeat? Because I wasn't sure I heard it. You said that there were three things that stood out that might be mediating the effect. What were the three things again?
Those three things were diabetes duration, insulin use, and albuminuria. So these are the three factors that we thought we had a prior knowledge that could be mediating the cardiovascular disease in type 1 diabetes. So that was the additional
Right.
model that we tested.
Got it. Got it. So, what are the key takeaways from this analysis?
First, people with type 1 diabetes and ASCVD are at very high risk for recurrent events. So, and numerically even higher than those with type 2 diabetes. Then, second, the intensive LDL cholesterol lowering with evolocumab, in addition to statins, can help mitigate this risk. And lastly, even though the LDL cholesterol reductions were similar in all groups, the clinical benefit looked the greatest in type 1 diabetes. And these really reinforce that the intensive LDL cholesterol management should be a central part of cardiovascular prevention in this population.
And finally, what are future research directions and how can we strive to have more people living with type 1 diabetes participating in outcomes research?
Thank you for the important question. I think we do need cardiovascular outcomes trials that are designed from the start to include and ideally focus on people with type 1 diabetes. That means capturing type 1 specific factors in more detail and setting eligibility criteria that make the recruitment easier, perhaps. And getting there will require coordinated efforts across specialties like endocrinology, cardiology, and nephrology, and active engagement with patient advocacy groups, industry partners, and research funders. And with these better representation, we can move beyond extrapolating from type 2 diabetes and create treatment recommendations based on strong condition specific evidence.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Yu Mi Kang, for sharing your expertise with us. Congratulations again to you and your colleagues for this insightful and necessary analysis from Fourier. Thank you for joining this podcast, and I encourage our listeners to read the full article in the September issue of Diabetes Care.
In the September 2025 issue of Diabetes Care is a feature article entitled Benefit of Semaglutide in Symptomatic Peripheral Artery Disease by Baseline Type 1 Diabetes Characteristics. Insights from STRIDE, a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind trial. I'm delighted we have joining us the article's first author, Dr. Neda Rasouli. Dr. Rasouli is a professor of medicine in the Division of Endocrinology, Diabetes and Metabolism at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, where she directs the Diabetes and Endocrinology Clinical Trial Program. Welcome, Neda.
Thank you, Dr. Rickel, for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here to have the chance to discuss our work.
And congratulations to you, Neda, and your co-authors on this feature article. I'm going to start by explaining that the STRIDE trial demonstrated that subcutaneous administration of the GLP-1 receptor agonist semaglutide at a dose of 1 milligram weekly improved functional capacity, symptoms, and quality of life in individuals with type 2 diabetes who have symptomatic peripheral artery disease. Neda, can you please tell us about this parent trial and about the new questions being addressed in your current study?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The STRIDE trial showed that semaglutide 1 milligram weekly improved maximum walking distance on the constant load treadmill test by about 40 meters in people with type 2 diabetes and early symptomatic PAD. In addition, semaglutide improved pain-free walking distance, quality of life, and ABI at weeks 52 and even 5 weeks after washout at week 57. In our current analysis, we asked whether the improvement in walking distance were consistent across subgroups defined by diabetes characteristics, BMI, and concomitant medications. What made the STRIDE cohort unique is that, on average, participants were not obese and had relatively well-controlled diabetes. The mean BMI was 28.5, and the baseline A1C was 7.1%. We specifically examined whether the benefits were consistent in obese versus non-obese participants, in those with A1C above versus below 7%, or in those with or without SGLT2 inhibitor in the background.
And to understand the outcomes, you mentioned maximum walking distance and pain-free walking distance, which were the primary and key secondary outcome measures examined at 52 weeks relative to baseline prior to intervention. And for those of us less familiar with these measurements and how they're conducted in a research setting, can you explain the treadmill test and what a detectable difference was seen with semaglutide and how this difference translates clinically for our patients?
Sure, let me go one step back and talk about the STRIDE eligibility. To be eligible for a STRIDE trial, patient had mild symptoms of PAD consistent with Fontaine 2A. Let me talk a little bit more about that. So at baseline, participants needed to walk at least 200 meters pain-free on flat treadmill, and their maximum walking distance on the constant load treadmill had to be 600 meters or less. That's why we talked about mild symptomatic. So these are the patients who were able to walk 200 meter pain-free on flat treadmill and up to 600 meter on constant load treadmill. I mentioned constant load treadmill. What I mean, the treadmill was set at a speed of 2 miles per hour with a 12% incline. So we used maximum walking distance on this constant load treadmill as the primary endpoint measured at baseline and again at week 52. And we compared the change in distance over time between the semaglutide and placebo groups using the estimated treatment ratio. For example, what we found, patients on semaglutide improved their maximum walking distance on constant load treadmill by about 21%, compared to 8% improvement with placebo. To see the beneficial effect of semaglutide subtracted by placebo effect, we used estimated treatment ratio, and it came out to about 1.14, suggesting 14% improvement in semaglutide group subtracting placebo effect. But all of this number, we want to see it in context, and this translated to roughly about 40 meter gain in walking distance on treadmill. And since walking on a treadmill with 12% incline requires about twice the energy of walking on level ground, this improvement kind of corresponds to roughly 80 meters improvement with semaglutide. And this is almost the length of a football field, which is clinically significant.
Yeah, that's really incredible when you explain it that way and just appreciating how steep a climb that is on the treadmill.
Exactly. And more importantly, the benefit was consistent across diabetes subgroups, including obese versus non-obese participants, those with A1C above or below 7%, and independent of their background medication, including SGLT2 or insulin.
So that's really great. And so seeing these consistent effects on functional outcomes across these different characteristics of individuals with type 2 diabetes, what makes that so important for clinical practice?
So as you mentioned, and we talked about that, we found that the beneficial effect of semaglutide on functional outcome or capacity were consistent regardless of obesity status, level of glycemic control, or use of background medication, such as SGLT2 inhibitor or insulin. So I think this is important because it shows that improving walking capacity in people with PAD doesn't depend on weight loss or tighter glycemic control or a specific medication combination. And I think the key message is we need to identify, again, I emphasize, identify people with PAD early before they reach advanced stages so we can intervene with functional improvement when it's still possible. So screening is especially important in people who are 65 or older, those with long-standing diabetes, such as diabetes duration more than 10 years, active or former smoker, and patient with other micro and macrovascular complications of diabetes. So we need to think about PAD in this high-risk population.
Yeah, and especially now with these benefits being shown from a available treatment that is being used now routinely. And so if the benefits of semaglutide on functional capacity are not being driven by reductions in body weight or the improvements in glycemic control that might be seen with GLP-1 receptor agonists, can you hypothesize some alternative mechanisms through which this intervention may be mediating these effects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me kind of summarize the data and the correlation we found. In the parent STRIDE trial, we found the correlation between weight loss and improvement in functional capacity was very weak. The correlation efficient was only 0.12 in the semaglutide group. So even when we looked at this correlation separately in obese versus non-obese participant, it was an exploratory analysis, but we did it to see what is the relationship between weight loss and improvement in functional capacity in obese and non-obese group. And still the relationship was weak and even non-existent. So we did the same thing with A1C, and we didn't find any correlation with change in A1C and change in maximum walking distance. So this kind of suggests that beneficial effect of semaglutide are not simply explained by weight loss or better glycemic control. We don't yet have a definitive answer on the mechanism. I really don't know the exact answer to your question. But I think my hypothesis is semaglutide may have some, we know that it has some anti-atherosclerotic effect, anti-inflammatory effect that can potentially improve perfusion through better endothelial function. And maybe these pathways are responsible in improvement in walking distance. But I really don't have a definitive answer for your question.
And so then what next steps are needed in this line of investigation? What further data are required?
I think what is important, as we discussed, we showed improvement in functional capacity in people with type 2 diabetes and PAD. It will be interesting if we can show this effect extend to people with PAD without diabetes. So that will be something interesting to investigate, whether people who do not have diabetes and they have PAD can be improved the functional capacity using semaglutide. My hunch is yes, but I don't know, and we don't have any evidence. And another thing that I think should be in the long-term plan are the studies that to investigate whether semaglutide can reduce hard outcomes such as acute limb ischemia or amputation. In a STRIDE trial, we focus on functional capacity, and from some post-hoc analysis of cardiovascular outcome, there is some hint that GLP-1 can reduce acute limb ischemia or amputation, but we don't have a dedicated study to show beneficial effect of semaglutide or other GLP-1 on hard outcome of PAD.
Well, it certainly sounds like there's compelling evidence from your current work that those studies now should be done. Do you have any final takeaway messages?
I will say I think it's very important to raise awareness about PAD among our providers and patients. I would emphasize again that PAD is a common and maybe the first manifestation of the atherosclerotic disease in people with diabetes. So it's very important when we see a patient with diabetes, ask right question about their symptoms and try to screen people who are symptomatic or high-risk patient even without symptom. That is what ADA guideline now recommends. Screen everybody who has symptoms of PAD, and high-risk asymptomatic patients should be screened using some sort of test such as ABI. So now that we have treatment available that shown to improve functional capacity, it's important to find patients at early stages when we can improve their maximum walking distance with the current medications.
That's wonderful. Dr. Neda Rasouli, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I really enjoyed learning about this novel medical treatment option for peripheral artery disease, and it's so important now to emphasize screening for this in our patients, particularly with type 2 diabetes, who may benefit in terms of their functional capacity, but also this may be a step towards hopefully preventing further complications for peripheral artery disease for our patients in the future. And I encourage our listeners to access the full article in the September issue of Diabetes Care.
Let's move on now to the Rapid Exchange segment, where Mike and I will discuss articles we found of particular interest this month. Mike, why don't you start?
Thanks, Alice. My first pick examines progression towards stage 3 or symptomatic type 1 diabetes in children and adults. Aaron Templeman from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, working with senior authors Dr. Richard Oram at Exeter and Dr. Emily Sims from Indiana University in Indianapolis and colleagues, examined longitudinal data collected from close to 136,000 children less than 18 years of age and almost 100,000 adult relatives of individuals with type 1 diabetes in the TrialNet Pathway to Prevention study. Among those individuals with a single type 1 diabetes associated autoantibody or multiple autoantibodies and stage 1 type 1 diabetes where glucose tolerance is normal, the risk for progression to stage 3 type 1 diabetes over 5 years was about 2.5-fold greater in children than in adults. However, among those individuals with multiple autoantibodies and stage 2 type 1 diabetes where glucose tolerance is already abnormal, 78% of both children and adults progress to stage 3 symptomatic type 1 diabetes over the next 5 years. These data support that interventions aimed at delaying progression from stage 2 to stage 3 type 1 diabetes be considered equally for adults as they are for children. And this is important since adults comprise more than half of cases of new onset type 1 diabetes, yet have received far less attention than children for considering potential disease modifying therapies.
I found that article also super interesting, and I have to say it's really only been over the last several years that there's been this much light shed, I guess, upon this topic. And as an adult endocrinologist, it wasn't something I had been thinking about until fairly recent. So these type of data really help to remind us of the importance to start thinking about these individuals, start looking for these individuals, and then I think better quantification, right, of their actual risk and then doing away with that assumption that this is more of a children issue, but in fact, very much an adult issue as well. So thank you, Mike, for sharing that. As we move towards greater use of GLP-1 receptor agonists in a broader group of people, it's always helpful to get reassuring data on the utility of these therapies. My first pick is a retrospective, population-based observational cohort study by Dr. Kevin Yao and colleagues from the University of Toronto, which aimed to evaluate the effect of GLP-1 receptor agonists versus DPP-4 inhibitor initiation on emergency department visits and all-cause hospitalization in adults with eGFRs under 90. Using administrative databases in Ontario, Canada, they identified 24,576 GLP-1 receptor agonist new users, and using something called inverse probability of treatment weighting, they identified a pseudosample of 23,600 DPP-4 inhibitor new users that were well balanced on all measured baseline characteristics. At baseline, mean age was about 69, 50% were women, 92% had type 2 diabetes, and 41% had stage 3 to 5 CKD, and semaglutide represented 98.4% of the GLP-1 receptor agonist prescriptions. They found that GLP-1 receptor agonist initiation was associated with lower risk of emergency department encounters and lower risk of all-cause hospitalizations with a hazard ratio of 0.9. Now, from a system cost utilization perspective, this is an important finding and complements the established cardiorenal benefits of GLP-1 receptor agonist use.
Great pick, Alice. I feel with earlier generation GLP-1 analogs that DPP-4 inhibitors were often tried first as add-on therapy for postprandial glucose control, and these findings now support considering going straight to GLP-1s with more recent generation analogs. My next pick examines use of an activity feature to reduce insulin delivery prior to planned aerobic exercise with the Omnipod 5 automated insulin delivery system. Lauren Turner, working with senior author Dr. Michael Riedel at York University in Toronto and colleagues from the Omnipod 5 exercise research group, performed a 3-way randomized crossover study of using the activity feature 30 or 60 minutes before undertaking 60 minutes of treadmill exercise compared to remaining in the standard automated or auto delivery mode in 38 individuals with type 1 diabetes. The percent of participants developing hypoglycemia during exercise was 24 and 29% with the two activity mode conditions, compared to 42% with the standard auto mode. However, that was not statistically different. There was, though, a significantly reduced insulin delivery in the hour before and during exercise with use of the activity features. And this also was associated with a significant attenuation of the decline in glucose observed during exercise when compared to auto mode. So these findings do two things, really. They support use of activity feature an hour before planned aerobic exercise, but they also highlight the ongoing need for additional strategies such as carbohydrate ingestion prior to and or during activity to further reduce risk for exercise-induced hypoglycemia.
Yeah, this is a good reminder to us and to people living with diabetes about sort of planning exercise when possible and using the activity feature. But what was interesting was that even when they didn't do it, numerically, there sounded like there was more hypoglycemia, but statistically not so much. It wasn't terrible. So then, as you said, there are other ways to do it, because if you think about life, it's sometimes hard to plan when you're actually going to do the aerobic exercise. So I think this is, it's good news all in all, and a good reminder of what people should try to do. Now, along the lines of providing reassurance, my next pick pertains to the implications of diabetes in pregnancy and offspring neurodevelopment. Dr. Hannah Gordon and colleagues from University of Melbourne, Australia, used population-level pregnancy and birth data from 2009 to 2021, linked with standardized national assessments, two of them. The Australian Early Development Census, or AEDC, which is done between ages 4 to 6, and the National Assessment Program Literacy and Numeracy, or the acronym NAPLAN, ages 7 to 8 years of age. Now, out of over 870,000 children born in Victoria, Australia between 2009 and 2020, nearly 178,000 had birth data linked with AEDC data at school entry, and over 115,000 had birth data linked with the NAPLAN scores at grade 3. Among the group that had the AEDC data, 9.2% of the children's mothers had diabetes in pregnancy. These mothers were more likely to be born outside of Australia, had polycystic ovarian syndrome, and required assisted reproductive technology for conception. Among the group that had the NAPLAN scores at grade 3, 6.5% of the mothers had diabetes in pregnancy. Bottom line, though, following adjusted analysis, diabetes in pregnancy was not associated with altered risk of overall developmental vulnerability compared with no diabetes. This is certainly welcome news for our patients living with diabetes in pregnancy, given that this kind of longitudinal data, I think, is really quite reassuring.
Welcome news indeed, Alice. And also reassuringly, no differences were seen in developmental or educational outcomes in offspring of mothers who either had pre-existing diabetes or those that developed gestational diabetes. My last pick examines preoperative predictors for metabolic outcomes 1 year after total pancreatectomy with islet autotransplantation, or TPIAT. While uncommon, total pancreatectomy is sometimes performed in individuals with recurrent acute or chronic pancreatitis for the purpose of pain relief. With islet autotransplantation, islets are isolated from the removed pancreas and returned to the same individual via a portal vein infusion, where the intrahepatically engrafted islets may alleviate and in some cases prevent the post-surgical diabetes that is otherwise inevitable with total pancreatectomy. Because the underlying pancreatic disease can affect islet mass and function, predicting metabolic outcomes for surgical candidates is challenging. So to address this, Dr. Piotr Witowski from the University of Chicago in Illinois, working with senior author Dr. Melina Bellin from the University of Minnesota and colleagues, conducted the multi-center cohort study POST for predictors of diabetes outcomes at 1 year after islet autotransplantation. With 384 participants undergoing TPIAT at 12 institutions across the United States, they found at 1 year, 83% had islet graft function as determined by C-peptide measurement. 60% maintained hemoglobin A1C at target levels less than 7%, and 20% were insulin independent. Preoperatively, having normal glycemia as assessed by hemoglobin A1C was a strong predictor of all three of these outcomes, while having a higher baseline C-peptide also predicted future islet graft function, white race glycemic control, and younger age insulin independence. Those characterized preoperatively as having prediabetes or diabetes by hemoglobin A1C clearly had less favorable outcomes. My takeaway is for appropriate candidates, including children, to consider TPIAT before impaired glucose homeostasis develops, and for all recipients to have realistic expectations and plan for requiring insulin therapy post.
And I think expectations are so important when making a decision around that, because I would imagine if they expected to be insulin independent for a long time and you had predictors that would suggest otherwise, it'd be worthwhile having that conversation ahead of time with the individual. So that's very useful information. Thank you, Mike. My final pick is an interesting study by Mr. Henrik Magnussen and colleagues with the senior author of Professor Tina Vilsbøl from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. MODY3 is a monogenic form of diabetes caused by pathogenic variants in the HNF1 alpha gene. People with the HNF1 alpha MODY have impaired beta cell function often before the age of 40, with complication risks comparable to that of type 2 diabetes. Treatment is usually with sulfonylurea, followed by insulin. Now, people with HNF1 alpha MODY have been noted to have increased urinary glucose excretion before the onset of diabetes, with a renal glucose threshold that is lower than those living with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. This has been attributed to decreased expression of the gene encoding SGLT2 based on a knockout mouse model and a human kidney cell model. This then called into question the utility of SGLT2 inhibitors in the treatment of HNF1 alpha MODY. So in this randomized double-blind crossover study, they investigated the impact of acute SGLT2 inhibition on glucosuria in people with HNF1 alpha MODY or type 2 diabetes. 11 individuals with HNF1 alpha MODY and 10 individuals with type 2 diabetes underwent 2 3-step hyperglycemic clamps targeted at 1-hour periods of 10, 14, and 18 millimoles per liter glucose with and without SGLT2 inhibitor. Now, the SGLT2 inhibitor they used was 25 milligrams of empagliflozin, and they measured the urinary glucose. Bottom line, urinary glucose excretion increased with SGLT2 inhibition with no difference between those with HNF1 alpha MODY and those with type 2 diabetes. Therefore, suggesting that SGLT2 inhibitor would be an effective glucose-lowering treatment in HNF1 alpha MODY, giving us another option.
That is another good option, Alice, as individuals with MODY3 are at risk for micro and macrovascular complications of diabetes. And so lowering glucose with a renal protective agent may be a welcome addition for some of those affected. Well, this brings us to the end of the September 2025 episode of Diabetes Care on Air. Big thank you to Drs. Yu Mi Kang and Neda Rasouli for sharing their expertise with us.
And a big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Remember that Diabetes Care is continuing to take submissions of original art for consideration to be included on a future journal cover. Don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about new episodes of this podcast, and happy talking like a pirate for the rest of this month. Thank you so much for listening.